Hello everyone, welcome to my patch 15.8 mid lane tier list. There's a whole bunch of mid lane champion changes in this patch, and there's also some interesting things in the meta that I want to talk about as well. So we'll go through champ by champ. I'll timestamp everything in the description. So first off, we have Ahri. The changes overall aren't too bad. So armor growth is kind of whatever. The big change is to the W. So the W here, you see the base damage goes from 45 to 145 to 40 to 120, which is a pretty big nerf. But it did gain damage in the total AP ratio. And then here, the cooldown also went up. At the same time, we have the Charm, which also gained percent AP. So this is trying to encourage you to build more full AP builds. The thing is, I'm actually not sure it really does that because, one of the nice things about the Roa build is that it's much easier to maintain high stacks on Dark Seal or even go to Magi. So I think sometimes with the Roa build, you can actually end up with more AP than the AP build anyway. So in my mind, the biggest nerf here to Ahri is that mainly most people were going W max second on Ahri because having the lower cooldown, especially when you're playing this DPS build, was really, really nice. I think now you have to max E second on Ahri instead of W, and I'm actually not sure that's that much of a nerf, but I do think if you are still maxing W after the patch, you are probably going to see that it's going to be a lot weaker. So I'd really recommend swapping over to Emax, but I still have Ahri as the best in the game. Now, she might actually be behind Taliyah, which I'll talk about a little bit later, but I still think she's basically just the perfect solo champion. Has the ability to neutralize any lane, super good at skirmishing, has mobility obviously, so I still think she's the quintessential solo queue pick as long as you're swapping over to Emax. And I still think you should default to the Rod of Ages build most of the time. If you're in a matchup where you can't really get punished or whatever, it's like an easy matchup, or maybe they have DPS or something to where the Roa is getting reduced value, maybe then I would go back to the Malignance or Blackfire into Lichbane, or just like the normal build essentially. But I still think you should be defaulting Rod of Ages. One other thing is I think people are definitely messing up their runes on Ahri a little bit. So the default, if you're playing the Roa build, is to go for this, right? Because chances are, if you're playing this, it's like you're playing it into some sort of assassin, in which case you'll take bone fighting, or you're playing it into some heavy poke like Victor, in which case you'll take second wind. Now, if you're not into one of these things and you still want to play the Roa build, then I'd actually recommend changing your runes. I would go for either this. So this is really nice because the summoner spell haste is really good for, well, flash charming obviously, but also the TP cooldown can be quite nice, and getting that one extra level, having that extra skill point earlier is actually a pretty big deal on Ahri. Alternatively, if you want more scaling, you can do something like this as your secondaries, right? I still think if you're playing Roa, you should be defaulting to the Resolve page, but I do see a lot of people running Resolve even in matchups they don't need it, and in that case, you really do want to go for a different rune page. So I've seen a lot of people quoting Ahri's win rate drop this patch, and I do think it's mostly because people are still maxing W, and people are still kind of taking the defensive runes in matchups that they don't actually need them in. Moving on to Annie. So overall, they did some pretty interesting changes. They tried to make it so there's just more power in her actual abilities and less in the bear. So I still have Annie in the B tier, but I'm honestly not sure where to put her. So the thing is that Annie is still going to suffer in high elo at least for a little while, even if she's good, because no one in high elo is actually good at Annie. And Annie is a champion that I think is harder than people realize. There's a lot to do with bear micro and abusing your auto attack range, your E movement speed and stuff. So I have seen people experimenting with Annie and high elo, but they're not winning a whole lot of games with it, and I actually suspect that's more due to them just not being that good at it as opposed to the champion actually being really weak. I also think that chances are that for the people that were kind of playing Annie as that quote-unquote easy pick, which I'm not sure if it was, but in theory it was, with all the damage being loaded into Tibbers, those people were definitely nerfed by this as well. So I suspect that Annie is overall kind of artificially weaker than she should be, or appears so, just because the lower elo players that had the just Flash R kind of playstyle, I think definitely got nerfed by this patch, and then also the high elo players that have been experimenting with Annie are probably not that good yet. So I suspect Annie could go up on the tier list in the future, but for now we'll just put her here. We'll wait until people get a little bit better at her. So going down, we have Hwei. So Hwei got some really nice changes, basically just to make it so that in the late game he feels a bit more satisfying, because definitely at the moment, or at least previously, he felt pretty underwhelming as he went to late game, just relative to kind of other mage damage. I think this is pretty good. I think the ulti change is kind of whatever, but the passive damage, especially if you proc it on multiple people, is really, really good. So that did move Hwei up. I think it was already a pretty underrated champ. Also does quite well in the Roa meta because he can punish the lack of wave clear that you have, like when you pick up Catalyst, right? Like if you go Catalyst to survive and Hwei goes Chapter just to wave clear, that's really, really good for him. And also, just with his burn builds, right, like Blackfire Leandry being the meta build, he is quite good against Roa Hell Stackers. So I think Hwei is, yeah, he's pretty good in the meta and also receives some nice buffs. Mel is another kind of weird one. So I think that the Mel changes are reasonably nice. Like I think this does increase the power of her early game a little bit, which is kind of nice. I've also seen some people experimenting this patch with actually taking Ulti Hunter on Mel, which is kind of like a new thing. I haven't really seen that before. So they go Comet primary and then Domination secondary, and maybe that's the tech. I haven't moved Mel up, even though I think she is like a little bit better early game now, which was one of her big weaknesses in the early laning phase. The reason I haven't moved her up is I think she actually is a little bit meta-gapped, so I think one of Mel's biggest strengths is around level 7 or so, when you've got like lots of points in queue, you have mana from Chapter, you can really start to bully out and potentially solo kill your lane. I think with Catalyst being such a strong component, that's a lot weaker. It's harder for you to actually score those kills. So yeah, potentially once Catalyst gets nerfed, which I assume it will eventually, Mel could come up a little bit, and I think there's still a little bit of room for optimization with Mel runes and builds and stuff. So yeah, kind of another champ to keep an eye on, but I think for now, just because of the strength of Catalyst, I don't see it moving it any higher. With the Syndra changes, Ryder trying to make it so she's not really a Blackfire Cosmic champion and moving back to Lute and Shadowflame, just because I think that most Syndra players, from a satisfaction point of view, do prefer Syndra as a burst mage. The thing is though, I don't think the changes do that at all. I think the changes overall are pretty whatever. Like I'd say these are kind of like net neutral. This is a slight nerf, but I don't think it's huge. And I really just don't think the changes actually do what Riot want. I think if they really want to kill the haste build, what they have to do is somehow reduce the power of the upgraded E. So I think doing something like reducing the potency of the slow, or maybe, you know, reducing the range on it or something, the radius perhaps, like there's things they can do. But I think as long as E is untouched, just the amount of like stuns and slows and stuff you can put out with your upgraded E is just too strong. So in my mind, this patch, Syndra is still very good. She's not quite S tier because she does kind of lack a little bit of safety, and I don't think she's a great abuser of the Roa, but she still scales very well in the meta, so she can play well into Roa champions. And yeah, I would just like basically play her the exact same as before with the Blackfire Cosmic. I don't think you need to change anything really. She's still super solid. The Tristana change I think was aimed more bot, but it does affect mid a little bit. Tristana gets a lot of threat or a lot of control over the way through kind of that implied threat of being able to jump on the opponent and like burst them. But also a lot of champions do just struggle keeping up with her push. I think it does like nerf her all-in potential, does definitely like weaken her 2v2 a little bit. I kind of think she's still like a pretty solid champion. You can mainly move her down just a little, but I'll kind of keep her here. I think that the AD mid pool and high-low is pretty restricted already, and Tristana being one of the more blind pickable ones, especially if Syndra is banned, I think is pretty valuable at the moment. Xerath, so the Xerath are kind of like follow-up buffs from the previous patch where they changed some things around. I think these are kind of nice. Like you do get a little bit more mana from this, and also just like a little bit more damage for the laning phase is kind of big too. I've actually played a lot of Xerath this patch. I think I've played like 5 or 6 games. I do think he feels pretty good. I think you're still kind of at the point though where there are like kind of better poke mages available. Like for me, I think Lux is still more valuable, and I also think Zoe, she'll talk about in a bit, is quite strong. And I do think Xerath is a little bit meta-gapped as well. Like, the ability to go Catalyst into Xerath is really, really good. But I think Xerath as a situational pick is super, super good. I think if you notice the enemy team has low engage, or you do have a matchup that doesn't have sustain or can't really build Catalyst or whatever, I think he has a lot of value. So I have been putting a lot of games on it. I think I've only lost 1 and it was really winnable. So yeah, I'm having a lot of fun with Xerath. I think definitely a champ worth trying out at the moment if you do like him. Yone got a little bit of a nerf to his W damage, but I still think the champion is kind of the premier AD mid, especially in this meta. You know, one of the keys being that, like, since it is a Rod of Ages meta and people have a lot of health, having sustained DPS is really important because you can't really burst people, right? And you even see other AD mids, you know, things like Zen and Nefiri going for there's more DPS or extended trade-focused builds, and I think that Yone is one of the best champions for doing that, on top of being one of the more reliable AD blind picks as well. I do generally think it is harder to blind AD compared to AP, And so there is value in the fact that, well, Yone is a flex, and also just with his sustain and gank setup, I think you can deal with most matchups, and he still gets played a lot. Like, I've seen a lot of Korean solo queue mids playing him a lot still, so I think super solid champion, wouldn't be worried too much about the nerfs at all. The Zoe change, I think, might be the most talked about change for mid lane this patch, which is that the damage fall off to secondary targets was removed. So previously it used to be that if you hit other targets with your Q, they took something like 20% less damage, you know, if they were the secondary target. And the reason that was a big deal is because, like, at level 5, for example, as long as you do it from max range, previously you could, if you queued the backline, you would kill one and you'd leave the others on low health, and then you'd have to order them and finish them or whatever. Now, though, you can one-shot the backline at level 5, and I believe you can one-shot the melee line at level 7. The thing is, though, a lot of the time you actually don't want to do that anyway, because, like, you kind of want to one-shot the backline and then, like, force your opponent to come up for the melees without any creeps in front of them. So I'm kind of the opinion that this does make a... It is a pretty big buff, I think, specifically to, like, that early laning, like the level 5. And it is also just, like, a quality of life feature, I think, for clearing waves after. But I don't think it's quite as insane as people are saying. I still think Zoe's like a really good champion for solo queue though, and that was the case before as well. So I think, yeah, she's been underrated for ages, and I think she is in a kind of weird spot in the meta though, which is that people rushing Catalyst means that oftentimes they're too bursty to actually be one-shot, and having that extra sustain does make them harder to kill. At the same time, though, again, one of those big weaknesses of Catalyst is the lack of wave clear. You don't get any AP, and so you're really reliant on base damages in order to clear the wave. And now, even though Zoe is not a Hwei user, she can, I think, punish them just by pushing waves. So in that sense, the extra damage to the melee creeps might actually be really valuable. I've played like maybe 3 games of Zoe this patch, and it does feel pretty good. But like I said, I think it's not quite as juiced as people think. But a super solid champion and has been for a long time. Tiny little change here to Cryptbloom, which is a game 5 ability haste. In my mind, still just not the best. I think the Void Staff just outstats it by a huge amount. In my mind, really the only time worth buying Cryptbloom is if, like, you're fighting a really important fight and you have gold to buy Cryptbloom and you don't for Void. So for example, if you have your Blighting Jewel, you have 1750 and you can buy Cryptbloom, but you can't afford a Void, I think that's the time to buy it. But outside of that, doesn't really feel that good. Opportunity also got a little bit of an increase here as well. I still don't think this is like that great an item overall. I think that Hubris is something criminally underrated. So that's something that probably should be bought more. And I kind of just don't think Opportunity has like a crazy niche cut out for itself, so I would probably still go the other ones, but I guess it is a little bit better than before. Now there's also a few champs I want to talk about, and the first one is Taliyah. So I am of the opinion that Taliyah might actually be the best mid in the game right now over Ahri, and there's a couple of reasons for that. So first off, Taliyah is also a really big beneficiary of the strength of Catalyst, right? Even though Roa, I think, is not an amazing item for Taliyah, I think Catalyst is really good because one of Taliyah's big weaknesses is laning, you know, against like the other strong laning mages, specifically around that time where, you know, in the first few levels, she can kind of like use her push to avoid kind of having too much interaction. But once those mages get chapter and a few points in their ability, they really start to hit Taliyah hard. And Catalyst makes it a lot easier to deal with that. And also, you know, the other weakness of Taliyah was playing against Assassins. And again, Catalyst makes up for that. So I think that Taliyah is really hard to punish in the current meta. And on top of that, she's very good against other Roa champs. She's probably the best answer to Ahri. Because, like, well, she kind of soft counters her with a dash, but also she can match her wave clear. And as a DPS champion, she does not care too much about people having all this extra health from Roa. So I think Taliyah is really good in the meta right now, and definitely a champ that is worth spamming if you haven't already. And specifically, if you're looking for a counter to Ahri, that could be something worth doing. You know, at the moment, maybe you're doing like blind pick Ahri, but if someone takes it away from you, going Taliyah can be very good. Another one I wanted to talk about is Galio. So I actually haven't seen a whole lot of Galio this patch, and my theory was that, like, okay, like, he's not a great Rod of Ages user because he has the tank build already, right? Like, it feels like if you want tankiness, that kind of already exists. I also was kind of thinking that, like, okay, maybe with other people building Rod of Ages, some of those matchups before, whereas like in a skirmish or a gank or whatever, you would like flash on them or find a way to taunt them, and then they just get one shot by the rest of your team. Maybe Galio's not as good at that because, again, everyone's quite a bit tankier than before. But I've noticed Caps has been playing a ton of Galio recently with Rod of Ages, so potentially there is something to that. You know, one thing that I think is really good about Rod of Ages is that it's very good on champions that actually get like full value from the level up. So there are some champions that kind of have a more or less like dead level up. And actually a good example of that is something like Taliyah, right? Like more points in Taliyah W or even Taliyah R are not super impactful, right? They're not useless, but it's not like a champ like Ahri where that extra skill point in W gives you damage, cooldown, everything. Same with E, right? And the R, you know, the levels themselves are very valuable. And I think Galio actually is one of those champs that benefits the most from having extra levels because all of his abilities are very solid. And also just as a kind of like melee frontliner champion, like extra base stats from leveling up are really, really good. So definitely underestimate the strength of Rod of Ages on Galio. Something worth trying, I think, if you guys want to do a little bit of experimentation. The final one I want to talk about on this list is Anivia. So I've always kind of been an Anivia hater, but this guy's ranked 23 on career. I think he was ranked 19 before, primarily playing as mid Anivia, although he plays it everywhere. And I've always thought this champ was kind of weak because, well, a couple of reasons. One, I think Taliyah is like sort of a better version of Anivia. I think she's better into these like melee heavy compositions. And the other reason was that really struggled into the strong laning mages. Now, there's kind of a couple of things with that. First off, again, Catalyst buff, really, really nice for Anivia. Makes it so that any of those super hard laning mages now are not so hard. And I also think a lot of people are probably building Roa into Anivia, which I think is kind of a mistake. So, like, not only have the matchups gotten easier because you get more sustain, but they're probably also getting easier because people aren't building the right thing into you either, which is super, super nice. Like, Anivia is actually quite good against compositions that lack damage because she ends up super, super tanky. So I think Anivia could be pretty good. I mean, obviously, it's got to be at least decent if you can get to rank 23 in career with it. Something I've kind of been thinking about lately is that there's a lot of champions where they don't get played in high elo because there's a better version of them, right? Taliyah, Anivia being an example. You know, maybe even things like Lux, Xerath, or like Ziggs, Zoe, right? Like, there's a lot of overlap with champions. And one thing that I've kind of been thinking about lately is that oftentimes, the difference between these champions that are kind of like the best and the second best is not as big as you'd think, but it's kind of like artificially, the gap is artificially created because the best players play the best champions. So you very rarely see the best champion, or sorry, the best players play a champion that's on a little bit of the weaker side. So even if Anivia is like weaker than Taliyah, right? It's like we don't really know how much weaker Anivia is than Taliyah because we never see the same caliber of high-level Taliyah players, right? Like think of your, you know, your UCals and stuff. You never see that caliber of player on Anivia because it's considered weaker. So I think that it's likely that there are champions that are, you know, still not like S tier or whatever, but actually like should be higher up on the list. And that's always been the case, but it's just something I guess I'm more aware of now, and I'm really looking forward to. Hopefully, I mean, I'm going to career soon. Hopefully, I'll play against them and get a really good idea of it. So I guess that's pretty much it. That was kind of just like a little bit of musings on Anivia. One last thing I'll add is kind of following on from that. Like, guys, you can get Challenger with anything on this list. You know, even the champions down here, right? Like, there's Challenger Kayle mains, there's Challenger Vel'Koz mains. You can get Challenger with anything on this list. So I would encourage you to put time into, you know, what you enjoy. You'll probably find that the champions up here are easier to have results on quicker, or when fully mastered are kind of like, you know, more rewarding. But hey, like, the game is meant to be fun, and like, if you like champs down here, don't let my tier list dissuade you. I'd also encourage you to check out other people's tier lists as well, because sometimes people have different opinions. So anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. Don't forget to like and subscribe. See you guys in the next one.